Hello, Blogging Heads Nation. It may not be morning in America, but it's morning on Blogging Heads. I'm Heather Hurlburt from New America.
And I am Daniel Drezner from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and the Washington Post.
And this is day number X that neither of us has been offered a job in the Trump administration.
We're going to have to start everyone for the next 4 years on that. That's awesome. Keep going.
But neither have a lot of other people, as far as we can tell. And one of the more raging sources of debate in Washington is is it incompetence or a deliberate strategy? Are we deliberately dismantling the administrative state by not hiring people to fill jobs? And B, the real heresy, does it matter?
Right. Both of which are challenging questions. On the first one, frankly, there's strong evidence for both, in that I tend to side, my general rule is that when an executive branch is screwing up, is there some deep Machiavellian design or is there incompetence? I always side with incompetence. That is almost always the general rule. Even in the conspiracy theory-laden Trump world, if something is going wrong, it's probably going wrong because people are not doing the right thing. It's not because they have some secret master plan. And I would argue that with respect to the cabinet appointments, that clearly seems to be the case, or the sub-cabinet appointments, that clearly seems to be the case, if no other reason that even the cabinet appointments, it seemed like the Trump transition team kind of had it ass backwards, where they would announce names and then go through the bother of vetting them. Whereas, as I understood it, and this is not a Democrat thing or a Republican thing, it was just sort of a mainstream thing, that for the longest time the pattern was you vetted these people before you would actually announce their names.
See, I viewed that as a clever strategy to save money by having the media do all the vetting for you. And you didn't actually need to hire a team of vetters that way.
Okay, but it also doesn't look good.
There's that.
There is that slight issue.
Well, we're going to need, sort of in terms of other things we're going to need to do in every Blogging Heads from here on out, it doesn't look good to us.
Right, okay.
And, I think the thing is here that Blogging Heads, and quite possibly people who watch Blogging Heads, are no longer the desired audience for this little fan dance.
That's possible, but I can't see how even, the most generous statement you could say is that the Trumpkins, as it were, don't care about any of this. In other words, if it turns out that the Army secretary, with the Secretary of the Army or the Secretary of the Navy or the Labor Secretary wind up withdrawing after they've been announced, that these are jobs that, frankly, no one cares about, and so it's not going to be that big of a deal. I can't see any way in which things like this, when they're not, there are announcements and then suddenly reversals, in any way seems good. I just think it's at best indifferent.
I want to back up a bit, and then to your assertion that, this represents incompetence or that the process isn't working, where I think it's entirely possible that the process is working exactly the way it's supposed to, which is to say that you have political teams from the White House parachuted into the agencies, and their job is to make sure that all 4,000 political appointee jobs are filled by people who share the mission, priorities, and principles, if you can call them that, of the incoming administration. And, there's been some media coverage. There's a very amusing piece this morning, I think, in Politico with some great blind quotes. You have a Treasury Secretary who actually tried to hire a Clinton donor. Shocking. You have both the State Department and the Defense Department that have tried to hire people who signed Never Trump letters, or people who were affiliated with prominent critics, and they get people not by name, but saying this is how this is supposed to work, and it's not going to change. And they get, by the way, they also get some quotes that you could hear coming out of the White House liaisons in any administration saying, these cabinet secretaries think that they control something and they need to learn they don't control anything. And that, that to me has been sort of an element of unreality that has permeated much of the commentary about the administration, particularly, frankly, our national security colleagues who are under the illusion that cabinet secretaries drive American foreign policy.
So here, unfortunately, I'm going to completely agree with you, because this is actually I know, but I actually do agree with you. This is an aspect of the reporting that I've been genuinely flummoxed by, where, there's a story that comes out that the Trump White House vetoes someone that a cabinet secretary wants, and that, oh my God, the Trump landing teams are trying to make sure that there's cabinet, like sub-cabinet appointments that are actually loyal to the White House. I mean, this has been the playbook in Washington since Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. The idea was you always try to appoint, loyal, politically loyal appointees 3 deep in an administration.
Isn't that more like going back to Adams and Jefferson?
I think my understanding was that Reagan was really the first modern president where I think it used to be the case that the cabinet officials did have more autonomy in terms of who they could pick for sub-cabinet. And I think it was, my understanding, the sort of conventional wisdom is always that it was Reagan that first really sort of centralized that process. Now, the counter I will offer, though, is that you can argue 2 things. First, admittedly, this is probably just rhetoric, but there was a lot of talk during the transition about how Trump really did plan on running a cabinet style of government, with the idea that he was going to outsource an awful lot of policy to the cabinet officials, and he would just be busy trying to make America great again, which meant he didn't have to do that much. The second, more important, I think potentially more substantive thing is, if there were actually implicit agreements by cabinet officials, if Trump offered, let's say, Rex Tillerson the position of Secretary of State, with the understanding that, or at least with Tillerson's understanding, that he would accept only if he was able to.
I think your dog is confessing that it's up for Secretary of the Army.
Dog was completely quiet this morning. Never mind. But basically, that if these cabinet secretaries came in with an implicit understanding from Trump that they would be able to pick certain people, and now they're finding that's not the case, that might also explain the many blind quotes that are in the Politico story.
The other thing that is worth pointing to over and over again is that ProPublica went out of its way to track down the backgrounds of as many as possible of the people who have actually come in at, the sub-confirmation level. So there have been, sort of building on the landing teams, there have been junior or mid-level folks brought into many of the departments. And now, it may be that the more sensational examples that appeared on Twitter last night were grotesquely cherry-picked, and most of them are
that
just
would never
fine
happen on Twitter.
Professionals. But there's at least one case, there's a nominee or an appointee who only finished high school in 2015. And it didn't seem to be the case of a person who'd had a challenging life and had gone back and finished high school after having a lot of work experience. That was not my impression of what had happened. There were a number of people with serious ethical or criminal lapses in their past. So it's interesting that the supposed indifference to putting people in jobs was overcome long enough to stick these people in jobs.
That is a fair point, although this raises a question where you're probably going to have better insider information than I do. The people who are on these landing teams, they are signing for short-term contracts. What is the percentage of these that will wind up with, is it Schedule C that wind up being Schedule C appointees?
No clue. And
okay.
it seems to vary quite a bit from department to department, that in some places you actually had multiple landing teams as sort of different people's fortunes went up and down in the transition. So I have heard of some places where people on landing teams have settled in and taken jobs, and others were not. So just,
right. And in some cases, the landing teams beyond the secretary mostly himself, are the only other Trump people that are there. I mean, in the case of like Rex Tillerson at State, the only other Trump people there or political appointees are from the landing team.
Yeah, that's not quite true, actually. Brian Hook is running policy planning there now.
That's correct.
And so there may be a couple of other appointees like that. And then my understanding is there's a number of staffers in policy planning as well, including the White House liaison person.
Right. And it's worth remembering, I specifically have a specific memory 8 years ago now, Anne Marie Slaughter was the head of policy planning at State, and she wound up actually having to staff Hillary directly for a fairly extended period of time because it was taking a while for the deputy and undersecretary people to get confirmed. But to be fair, I'm pretty sure by this point at least we actually knew who the deputy and undersecretaries of state were going to be. All we know with the Trump people is who is not going to be. Namely, it is not going to be Elliot Abrams, and we know it's not going to be John Huntsman now because Huntsman's been announced to be the U.S. ambassador to Russia.
And the hot gossip around Washington hot several days ago is that it's also not going to be Paula Dobriansky.
Oh, okay.
Was another kind of mainstream Republican national security figure who had been rumored to be up for it for quite a while.
Does the D.C. scuttlebutt say anything about John Bolton? Because that would be the logical name that I would think will wind up, potentially being put forward. Not by logical, I don't mean in the sense of this is a good idea. I just mean in Trump world.
You will remember that the Tillerson camp made darn sure that the New York Times knew that Tillerson did not want Bolton.
Yes, but this raises a much deeper and more awkward question, which is, does it really matter what Tillerson wants?
Well, so this is where, both at State and Defense, so far, you do seem to be seeing that the cabinet secretaries have enough clout to refuse. That they don't necessarily have affirmative clout to get people in that they do want, but you do, it does look as if cabinet secretaries have been able to either refuse or actually, in the case of the service, some of the trouble with nominating service secretaries at DOD, it looks to me as if Mattis has actually been able to get people to withdraw.
Right.
I may be overstating that.
Well, I was just saying, this goes back to the original point about whether these people have been vetted prior to the announcement. So this leads us to the next question, which is, I agree with you that there seems to be a mutual veto process at work, which is that the problem is that the White House can veto a name put forward by the cabinet secretary, and the cabinet secretary appears to be able to veto a name put forward by the White House, which means, all the national security bureaucracies are essentially at this point not just understaffed in terms of political appointees, but because the names haven't even been agreed upon yet, they're going to be understaffed for months to come. Does that matter?
Yeah, so this is where I am a bit of a minimizer in terms of how much that matters, which I recognize will make me very unpopular. And no, I am not saying that it is in any way a good thing. But I think the case that I've heard made that I really push back on strongly is the idea that once the bureaucracy is staffed up, it'll all be okay. And that, which thereby suggests that the primary problem that we have with this administration is the absence of smart senior people. And once smart senior people are in place, everything's going to be fine. And that, I as much as I have lots of respect for our smart senior people across the political divide, that's just not true.
Well, okay, let me push back on that, which is to say, the way I would look at it is that you do want, the cabinet people do need, deputies and undersecretaries and so forth, because the problem is not so much, I wouldn't describe the problem the way you're saying it. The problem I would describe as the White House is unfortunately fully staffed up. And because proximity to the president matters, the sort of biggest flubs that have been coming on the foreign policy / national security side have been coming almost entirely from the White House, not from the departments. And the problem is that so long as you have a Steve Bannon who has a fair amount of staff, and so long as you have a National Security Council where House from, basically Michael Flynn's house has not been cleaned out, the result is, and furthermore, let's just say it, we've got a president who really has an unconstrained id and unfortunately access to his iPhone. The result is a world in which the constraining forces on the White House screwing up are not all that powerful. So I agree with you. Once you get all these deputies and undersecretaries and so on and so forth, I don't think anything is going to be peachy keen. I just do think there might be something more of a check and balance against the White House just doing things really, really stupidly.
Well, let's take a few of the sort of let's take some of the highlight reel from the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks. So, Tillerson goes to Mexico to try to improve the situation with Mexico, and the president decides to fire off some more obnoxious tweets about Mexico. Mm-hmm. Now, there's nothing that having an undersecretary or a regional assistant secretary would have helped you with there. The refugee ban. I mean, either you think the Muslim ban is still bad policy, or you think it's good policy. If you think it's good policy, or if you think it's like okay policy, you think it's not really that big a deal. If you think, it's not really that big a deal one way or the other, then you really don't want the number of sort of social media commentaries about how it was still a Muslim ban that came, or how it was still targeted in particular ways that came out while it was being redrafted, thus carefully undermining the bureaucracy's efforts to create a product that would stand up in court. And that, again, is another one where, the central problem of this administration, I just don't think is going to be curbed through the usual bureaucratic methods.
Well, I'm not going to dispute that. It's definitely hard to push back against that argument. The other argument, though, I would say two things. First, even if, let's say on the immigration order, again, I don't like the revised order, but I think even proponents of it would acknowledge that the process by which the original order was issued was really bad, and that had they actually gone through the interagency process a little bit better and a little bit more carefully, they could have avoided an awful lot of the negative blowback that the first month of the administration, had to cope with. So things like that might have been avoided. The second thing that I'm worried about is essentially if in some ways the administration has been fortunate so far because there has not really been a precipitous foreign policy crisis. I think the closest you can come to is the North Korea situation, and that could actually mushroom further. And what worries me is that, let's say the North Korea situation does mushroom further. Who the hell is the point person to China? Who the hell is the point person to South Korea? Who's the point person for Japan? That is where you actually do need a few actual people. And that really does concern me, I think.
Yeah. And I can't disagree with you on that. And that actually seems like as good a moment, if any, to pivot to North Korea.
Yes.
Which helpfully in the midst of all this, we have what you could argue is a slow rolling crisis with the North Koreans, who first, appear to have killed the leader's brother in a fairly problematic, according to anyone's understanding of law, way.
Also, I believe the word gruesome comes to mind, given that how he was killed. Yes.
Yes. Bizarre.
Yeah.
But in addition to that, had a new round of missile launches, and which, on the one hand is concerning enough all by itself. On the other hand, we're sort of, in some ways, the American polity is used to the North Koreans firing off missiles every now and again. Jeff Lewis makes a point, which I think is worth considering, particularly in your context about staffing and regional relationships. He says the U.S., South Korea, and Japan are engaged in military exercises right now. And let's be clear, what the U.S., South Korea, and Japan are practicing is the prep for an invasion of North Korea. He says,
decapitation would be
when Kim launches missiles and then helpfully sends out press releases with little circles drawn showing you all the other things that they could hit based on where and in this case all the U.S. bases or South Korean bases, it really cliff notes, really, really helpful to the analyst. He says, so the North Koreans are practicing a preemptive nuclear strike. And he has the wonderfully memorable line, which is, he says, South Korea, North Korea, and the U.S. all have plans for the peninsula that assume that they would go first, and 2 of the 3 of them will be wrong.
Yes. No, I read that article. I then drank an entire quart of Maalox after reading that article. And furthermore, Lewis doesn't even talk about the fact that, the U.S. has now deployed THAAD to South Korea, which has, of course, annoyed the Chinese no end for a variety of reasons. So that also makes coordination on this issue.
I'm going to invite you to go into that a little more, actually, because I think my bold prediction is that we're heading into a couple of years where we're all going to have to, well, those of us who have rusty missile defense knowledge from the 80s are going to have to haul it out, and those of you who don't are going to have to share the pain of the old folks. So Dan, remind us why THAAD bothers China? I mean, it's just can't they tell it's just aimed at Pyongyang?
So, my understanding, and for the love of God, please correct me if I'm wrong, is that because this is a little further afield from my expertise, but my understanding is THAAD is designed, again, you would presumably think, well, it's purely a defensive weapon. It's designed to combat North Korea if it launches missiles against South Korea. What possibly could China have to protest? And China's answer is that we don't think THAAD is really going to work terribly well against North Korea, but what will work super well is the radar systems that are attached to THAAD to monitor what the hell China is doing in Northeast Asia. Therefore, in some ways, this is a replay of the objections that Russia had to the missile defense system that was imposed in Eastern Europe as Iran was, developing its ballistic missile program, where Russia argued, this isn't designed to combat Iran, this is designed to watch and monitor us. And so this is why the Chinese have been vociferously objecting to any actual THAAD deployment for years now. And in some ways, and let's be fair, this is one area I want to stress where, as much as I'm very concerned about what the Trump administration will do, I think this is one of those areas where they can legitimately say, look, we inherited this problem. This is not a problem of our making, and they are absolutely right on that. The Obama administration, very famously, Obama told Trump, this is the, issue number one on your security platter going forward. And again, to be fair, somewhat, the Obama administration inherited from the Bush administration. So this has been a bipartisan foreign policy train wreck for quite some time. But that said, did I get the THAAD description correct?
Well, the only piece I was gonna add to it is that the other sort of challenge that THAAD introduces is if the North Koreans, so we just said we're living in a world where everybody thinks they have to go first, that the alternative to going first is annihilation of your government, if not of your society. So if the North Koreans think that they might not be able to go first anymore, or that there's a time and after that time they might not be able to go first.
Right, this is a closing window, yes.
Yes, then you conceivably, either you egg the North Koreans on to act sooner, you egg the North Koreans on to build more and more and more missiles or more advanced delivery systems or different kinds of delivery systems, and that conceivably this supposedly defensive technology ends up making the peninsula even less stable than it is now, without necessarily giving you ironclad security if you're sitting at a cafe in Seoul.
Yeah, so this raises the very, very awkward question of what do you do in this situation? Because I wrote about North Korea and sanctions when I was doing my dissertation back 20 years ago.
Yeah, and it hasn't gotten any better.
No, there's a quote that I remember from that book where I basically said, where a U.S. policymaker said all policy options stink. Yeah. And that has not changed in 20 years. The only thing that's changed is the situation has gotten somewhat worse because North Korea now has nuclear weapons. So, I guess, let me put it this way. If there was ever a moment where presumably some sort of actual outsider were to come in and come up with some sort of disruptive way of thinking anew about how to deal with this situation, I might actually be somewhat receptive to that idea. I just don't know what the idea is that would actually alter the status quo.
Well, it's funny you mention that because, of course, there was a report recently that supposedly someone had in fact had that idea and had been using it for the last, 5 to 8 years, and that supposedly we were launching offensive cyber operations, which was explaining why quite so many of the North Korea's missiles tended to go plop in the sea where they weren't supposed to. That right. is, I have no way of judging independently the veracity of that, and it's certainly not all that reassuring after they managed to put 4 right where they wanted to put them this past weekend. So, right. So that's it's a good reminder that even sort of disruptive ideas maybe only disrupt so far.
They're temporary. I mean, in much the same way that Stuxnet in Iran was, clearly was only a temporary measure, and also led to blowback that I think was in some ways was far worse down the road.
Yep. Yeah, so the 2 things that I was going to say about North Korea policy, neither of which is a panacea, but both of which are going to be even harder to do in this environment. One is you have a wing of the security community and of the Korea Watcher community that has wanted to start some kind of direct outreach to the regime for a while. Now, you aren't going to do that right after they offed the guy in the airport. That's just... That's not a realistic thing to ask a government to do, even if it's not this government, which is particularly ill set up to talk to forces like the North Korean government. But
I don't know what the hell you're talking about. I mean, I'm sure this is just another number that Jared Kushner can put on his cell phone and handle, on his own. Alas, Jared Kushner. Although I do, the mental picture of Jared Kushner going to North Korea is an interesting one. Oh, I would pay money to see that. Yeah, it's not the most insane idea, unfortunately. That I'm just going to pause and note that if I had told you that a year ago we were going to have a conversation about where one of the bright ideas that U.S. foreign policy could come up with would be to send the president's son-in-law to Pyongyang, we both would have drank a lot more, I think, in the last year. No, I would have looked at you and said, yes, it is a measure of Hillary Clinton's brilliance that she would consider sending Jared Kushner to Pyongyang. Good counter. Sorry, go ahead. The other sort of serious substantive point here is that you really cannot imagine, it's very hard to imagine a path to dealing with Pyongyang in a non-nuclear Holocaust way that doesn't involve really close working with China. And Correct. Now, the good news here, I think, well, maybe I'll start with the bad news and then we'll go on to the good news because maybe you can explain the good news to us. But obviously the bad news here is that security cooperation with China seems to be very low on Trump's list of priorities. And his defense establishment guys are also people who are not enthusiastic about the sort of cooperation potential with China. They don't come from the panda-hugging wing of the security establishment. Right. The good news, however, Professor Drezner, is how many new trademarks did the Chinese government just give Trump business interests? So clearly, things are looking up, and it's all going to be okay, right? Yes, now that Trump escorts is a thing in China, Wait, so that's real? I saw that on Twitter, and I was hoping it wasn't real. I saw it on Twitter as well, and I haven't clicked on the link, but that's not a sentence that you. I haven't clicked on the link for a whole variety of reasons. So that's one of those things where I'm just going to assume the legend is true. All right, so. Let me put it this way. Bruce Jones, I think, and Jonathan Pollock had a piece in Nikkei World Review, I think, but also for Brookings, where they basically argued that if you take a look at what the Trump administration has done with respect to the Pacific Rim, it is weirdly their most conventional area. In other words, that for all that the administration said, during the campaign and for all the Trump phone call to Taiwan and so on and so forth that happened during the transition, we are now in a place roughly where we would have expected to be had any other Republican won the nomination and been elected president. So wait. Are you telling me that kicking the TPP to the curb didn't really matter very much? I'm shocked. I forgot about TPP, so no, I'm not going to. All right. I meant security, which of course TPP is part of, and that drives me around the freaking bend, but let's not get into that. So TPP accepted. The fact that the administration is now essentially reverted to one China, which you can argue has been Tillerson's greatest accomplishment so far as Secretary of State. The fact that the administration has clearly provided, verbal, reassurances to both Japan and South Korea about the security relationship. The fact that Mattis has been out there also to reassure somewhat nervous allies about what is going on, and that THAAD is being deployed, which the Obama administration would have done in all likelihood had there been a third term or had Hillary Clinton been president now, I would suspect. So on all of those things, despite all the rhetoric about how there was going to be, a new kind of thinking, really what's happened to date has been pretty much the standard playbook, which, by the way, I think is, again, somewhat mixed news, because on the one hand, it suggests that Trump is not going to be terribly unconventional when it comes to this part of the world. The problem is that I'm not convinced that the conventional way of dealing with this really gets us anywhere better. It just becomes slightly more predictable.
So I got two questions for you on that. One is, Obama had done pretty well at building up relationships in Asia. Some of his closest relationships were with Asian leaders. And Clinton, of course, was well known in the region as well. Do we think that the region that were sort of interesting, there was interesting divergent reporting in terms of what people in Asia thought about the idea of Trump being president. Do we think that Trump and his cabinet go to Asia with what sort of degree of rapport, of respect, of perception of America as a declining or present influence in the area? How has that been affected? Or perhaps you'd like to make the brand of political science argument that says that doesn't matter.
Heather, since the days of Thucydides, I've always wanted to do that. Since the days of Thucydides, great powers have always been had to project the, reassure nervous ally. No. So, how would I put this? My understanding is that on the Chinese side, you can argue that I don't think they know what to think at this point. I think there was some genuine enthusiasm for Trump during the campaign, both because, generally speaking, China prefers Republicans in power, and they like the idea that Trump was a businessman, and they really didn't like Hillary Clinton. In no small part because this goes all the way back to the Women's Day speech, the Women's Conference in Beijing. Obviously, the questioning of one China totally scrambled that, which truly led to a chill in that sense. I think the problem is, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the way the Chinese like to deal with the United States is they like one interlocutor. They like to know that there is a reliable channel. Now, during the Bush years, that was, towards the end, it was Hank Paulson that they primarily talked to. During, the Obama years, it was Jim Steinberg and or Tom Donilon. And during the second part of the Obama administration, there wasn't a lot of people, which was part of the problem. I don't know if it's supposed to be Terry Branstad. I don't even know if Terry Branstad has been confirmed yet.
No.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was honestly, that pick for him to be ambassador was the one that I probably am been the highest on among Trump's coterie, because that actually made a great deal of substantive sense, especially given his close ties to Xi Jinping. I think the problem is at this point is that no one knows exactly what to expect from this administration. And it's been part of a larger issue with this administration on both foreign economic policy and foreign policy, which is it's not that you can't point to statements that have been made by some people that should be reassuring to allies and or understandable to rivals. It's that there has been no coherence whatsoever. That you've got the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense saying one thing, but then you have the White House saying something else, and there's no way to interpret what's going on.
Well, that sort of loops back around to the other thing that I wonder about China policy, which is part of what seems to me, I mean, our China policy is always somewhat incoherent in this regard, and Trump kind of perfectly encapsulates it, that you have both this urgent need to have the economic relationship with China, and at the same time, a desire to stake out a fairly, at least rhetorically, hawkish stance on the security side. And to what, should one assume that the security side wins in the end? Should one assume that the economic side wins in the end? How do the Chinese authorities view the interplay between the two sectors? How can we citizens understand what the hell is going on there?
Look, if I had to bet which side is going to win out, it's going to be the security side every day of the week and twice on Sundays. For a few reasons. The first is that the security side generally often tends to win out in these situations. I think with Trump that's particularly concentrated. First, because Trump really does have a legitimately different view on the way in which trade is supposed to benefit, or the economic relationship is supposed to benefit the United States. I think a deeper psychological reason for Trump is that the only group of actors, Trump respects two kinds of people, which is generals and billionaires. And he's got more generals on his national security cabinet than he does billionaires. And even the billionaires are a little dubious about the economic relationship with China. So, and that doesn't even count the White House people who are all, sort of economic nationalists on this front. So I can't see a scenario where if a crisis with China, emerges and the president, is asked to weigh the costs and benefits of disrupting the economic relationship as a way of bolstering America's security position in the Pacific Rim. I can't see who's going to tell him, no, you got to worry about the economics of this. There are mutual costs on this. He's not going to care about that.
That makes sense. This also seems, and I noticed Jared Bernstein was out there this morning sort of trying to list off the number of misunderstandings of how trade works that had been enunciated by the administration in recent days. And that did sound like kind of the perfect topic for a Dan Drezner listicle.
Oh, Christ. So I wrote something for the Post this morning on this where, my favorite quote, I believe, which Wilbur Ross said on CNBC, was that the problem is not that the U.S. dollar is overvalued. It's that other currencies are not as expensive as they should be, which if I could head desk onto the laptop, I would, because that's a distinction without a difference. Not to mention that, and again, this is another example where there's policy incoherence, because you have Peter Navarro running off, and talking to, writing op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and talking to the Wall Street Journal, saying things like, we want to negotiate directly with Germany on how we can reduce our bilateral trade deficit. And there's like 6 different ways I can explain that that's not how this works. The most obvious being is that Germany has no trade competency on this front. That it really is a EU-wide aspect of this. And then there's also the most painful thing I have read over the last week or so was Michael Grunwald had a great piece in Politico earlier this week talking about the ways in which the Obama administration actually did renegotiate NAFTA. And the way they renegotiated NAFTA was by negotiating the TPP. That the one of the utilities of the Trans-Pacific Partnership for the Obama administration was because both Canada and Mexico wanted in. They had to make greater concessions than they had made for NAFTA, in terms of Mexico on labor rights and in terms of Canada on dairy imports. And basically, the U.S. didn't have to give up anything because what the U.S. was able to offer was membership into TPP. But then, of course, that was, as you said, the very first thing, the first meaningful thing the Trump White House did, which was to pull out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which raises a really interesting question, which is that the Trump administration clearly seems to believe that multilateral trade regimes are not in its interest, that the better way that it can conduct trade policy is through a series of bilateral trade deals. And I think the argument they must be making or thinking is that in a bilateral situation, because the U.S. has such significant amounts of market power, it can, essentially dictate terms to other states, and therefore will be able to get what it wants. I would say a few things on this. The first is that presumes that you're starting from tabula rasa, that you don't have pre-existing trade agreements, and the problem is that you do. So unless the Trump administration actually withdraws from the WTO and NAFTA, which there is a chance it will do, I can't. There's a non-zero probability that happens. Unless it really does actually totally wipe the slate clean, I don't think that strategy works. The second thing, and this is almost banal to point out, but it really does need to be said, I don't think it occurs to either Trump or his trade negotiators that trade negotiations are designed to be win-win arrangements. Which is, Grunwald has this great quote from Trump complaining during the campaign that, like, U.S. trade negotiators almost were acting like they wanted... That's my dog calling, asking for you to vet him. That's... that... I totally lost my train of thought.
Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Trump basically said, it's like U.S. trade negotiators want other countries to win from trade deals. And the answer is the dirty secret is that trade negotiators want the other country to win also from trade deals. That's the way in which trade deals sustain themselves. And if they don't, if the other country doesn't benefit, shockingly, they're not going to want to sign a trade deal. And furthermore, because of the way in which Trump has jawboned countries like Mexico or others, the political incentives for those countries to sign, enhanced trade deals with the Trump administration has been dramatically reduced. There's no way that the president of Mexico is going to be able to sign any kind of trade deal with the Trump administration and not be immediately kicked out come the 2019, I think, or 2018 Mexican presidential election. That person he might be kicked out anyway, but that doesn't change the dynamics we're talking about here. And then there's one last reason that I think the Trump administration doesn't like multilateral trade rules, which is that these guys are populists. And by populists, I don't just mean economic populists, they're political populists as well. And the one thing political populists don't like is alternative centers of power. And the thing that the WTO and or the TPP would have offered are dispute settlement understandings that are outside the purview of the United States, and that forces the United States to comply if it loses on a trade dispute, which happens from time to time, even though the U.S. benefits a great deal from these understandings.
I'm chuckling, Dan, at the image of given the enormous unpopularity of the dispute resolution processes and the perception of them as sort of being totally divorced from the interests of regular Americans. I'm chortling at the idea of you reinventing them as an anti-Trump feature. So I'm just being entertained by that.
Well, I think, first of all, let's be blunt. The American public has no idea what the dispute settlement understanding is. This is not a process that I think generates feelings one way or the other.
I would if you look at sort of not the people who came out and told pollsters they didn't like TPP, but the people who made the choice to make TPP an issue around which there was organizing, the dispute resolution mechanisms, the dispute settlement mechanisms are one of the major rallying points. You would be surprised. It's an interesting commentary on globalization and its discontents, because you're absolutely right that the people who designed them never ever imagined them having anything to say to citizens. And I mean, frankly, that's part of the problem, that the whole structure was allowed to grow up as far as it did without anybody thinking about, how to make it fit into our or any other democratic society. But I did want to just get in an in defense of Trump sentence, which just for fun, because it's surprising when I do that. But in defense of Trump, I mean, with the exception of TPP, I mean, it's been a not so controversial bipartisan viewpoint for a while now that multilateral trade deals were on life support, right? That they had become so difficult and so complicated that, there was a long stretch of time, if we're honest, starting with the deals in the late Clinton administration through Bush, and then certainly the bilateral deals in Obama's first term, where everybody was going for bilateral instead of multilateral. So that is a place that I mean, I totally agree with you about the sort of zero-sum economic view of the world, which it makes it hard to do any kind of trade deal.
Yeah.
But the disdain or the perception of inutility in multilateral trade processes is not unique to the Trump administration.
No, but I would push back on this sense. First of all, I would agree that the perception was, and the perception was accurate, that continued liberalization through the WTO, through things like the Doha round, the transaction costs on that track had become prohibitive. There's no denying that, and I'm not going to defend that. But I would say there were two other recognitions. The first was that even if there wasn't going to be much further liberalization via the WTO, that the WTO had already accomplished a fair amount in terms of liberalization, and part of the reason that you did not see a return to protectionism post-2008 was that, in fact, the WTO did a relatively decent job of keeping protectionism at the ticky-tack level rather than being more substantive, and part of that was due to the dispute settlement understanding. So it's almost a stock versus flow question. I would argue the WTO still matters a great deal in terms of preserving the degree of trade liberalization we've had to date. If you want to talk about going forward, I'm not going to dispute that point. I think you're right about that. Yeah. But even there, the response by the Obama administration to that was not more bilaterals. I mean, inherited some bilaterals from the Bush years. But even there, so I'd say two things. First, during the Bush years, the reason there were bilaterals was that Bob Zoellick actually thought that if you signed enough bilaterals, it would eventually put pressure on other participants in the Doha round to complete the Doha round. Now, that turned out not to be true. So I'm not going to to say Bob Zoellick was right, but I would say that is a classic example of trying to use, bilateral or regional deals as a way of pushing the multilateral process, much in the same way that NAFTA, seemed to do for the Uruguay round of GATT. The second thing I would argue is that the Obama administration, by its second term, had arrived upon a strategy which was not to pursue any more bilaterals, but instead to do these mega regional deals, namely TPP and TTIP on the transatlantic side. And it will always be my frustration. I still owe Phil Levy from the Chicago Council a massive steak dinner because I thought those deals were going to be done by the end of the Obama second term, and clearly he was far savvier on that than I was. But I would argue that those deals were of significant size to justify, doing them, and they had enough multilateralness, for lack of a better way of putting it, so that they could lead to things like Canada and Mexico making the necessary trade concessions. So you're right. I don't want to say that the multilateral trade system is working perfectly. It certainly is not. But it has accomplished a great deal, and I think throwing it out because you're not seeing any forward momentum would be an act of lunacy.
Yeah, I want to stipulate that one can be TPP neutral or a TPP skeptic and still think that assaults on the WTO and other sort of core principles of how we do trade and of how the U.S. has set itself up to be an engine of trade globally are going to be, quite likely do more harm than good for the American worker and quite possibly catastrophic for the global system. And one can believe all of that and at the same time note that the most dire consequences that seem to have emerged from the collapse of TPP are political, which may suggest that there was not as much there as TPP proponents like to suggest.
Well, again, this is one of these questions. I mean, it's always the politics of counterfactuals. I was always a fan of TPP, not so much for the economics of it, but for the security of it. Which was a way to signal to our allies in the region that we weren't going anywhere. And I think in some ways it allowed for a slight tweaking of NAFTA. And this goes back to this thing we talked about the last issue of Drezburt, which is one of the problems we have now in Washington is when there are deals that are struck, both domestic and international, eventually problems emerge because these are always imperfect deals. And the ordinary, it used to be the case when that would happen that you would then tweak them somehow, and there would be bipartisan support for the tweaking. That is gone now, and so as a result, you're in a situation where any neutral policy observer will acknowledge that NAFTA probably in some ways does need to be renegotiated across a variety of issues, just because the actual, things like, local content of automobiles was written 25 years ago, and autos have changed a wee bit since then. So it would be entirely appropriate for everyone to update that. The problem is that you're not going to see any support for that, or you're not going to see a bargaining core for that, because each of the numerous actors have very different policy preferences on this. So that's the depressing thing about this entire conversation.
Yeah, well, just in case we weren't being depressing enough, as kind of a final set of thoughts, I really didn't want to lose, the point you made that the core difference in Trump's approach is not even actually whether he cares about dairy access with Canada or labor rights in Mexico or TPP itself. The core difference, is that both on the economic and on the security side, it is a very zero-sum, what have you done for me lately approach to the world. And on the political and security side, it's a vision of America's prosperity and safety that defines America quite differently from how Democrats, but also how the center-right had defined America in recent years. And that, to me, just to loop all the way back to our initial conversation, the intensity of my frustration with colleagues and commentators who assert that, getting the right staff people in place will solve the problems that we face is, you still have a president who's been very careful to appoint all White House staff and many cabinet appointees whose idea of the America and the aspects of America that need defending are different from that which, number one, many of us believe in, and number two, which we have been propounding highly imperfectly and with many screw-ups, but nonetheless, which we have been propounding around the world in the post-Cold War era. And so, you can have a great and very effective Secretary of State, and you can have an excellent team. And if you're still telling your Muslim allies, A, we don't want you coming here. B, we don't think your religion's really a religion. We think it's an ideology. And C, we're edging toward changing that in our country so your co-religionists who live here don't enjoy the same First Amendment protections that, Jewish Dan Drezner and Christian Heather Hurlburt do. That is not a problem that an undersecretary of state can fix, and it is not a problem that the political establishment should be pushing away from its consciousness by saying to itself, we'll get the undersecretary in there and he won't be able to embarrass us quite so badly.
No, I would say the most embarrassing aspect for the last week or so of the Trump administration was the fact that Rex Tillerson did not appear when the State Department issued its annual human rights report, which is a sort of big deal that the State Department does every year. And again, even if, in some ways, this is actually, I think, is the most telling aspect of the Trump administration's approach to the rest of the world, which is they're de-emphasizing, human rights to a great degree. Now, I would argue there is a good debate to be had about the extent to which human rights and democracy promotion should be a big part of American foreign policy. And I think it's perfectly fine to say that should be radically de-emphasized in the world we live in. But even people who ordinarily are extremely phobic about talking about this stuff, I think we're somewhat taken aback that Tillerson did not even, introduce the human rights report, because that was pretty much sort of how it's been done, for decades. And even if you say that it shouldn't be a top priority, there should be no problem whatsoever with reporting on this stuff. And instead, the reporting itself even got de-emphasized. So as a result, even let's say libertarians who ordinarily are not big fans of talking about this said, yeah, this is a little weird.
Yeah, and again, to point to sort of what's an underlying problem that we see reflected across agencies is this idea that the ruling powers can dissociate themselves from and discredit particular things that are being done by the government, which is allegedly the expression of them and of all of us. And that points down the road toward personalized rule, where it no longer matters what the State Department says. It only matters what the White House says. And there again, it shouldn't matter whether you care about human rights or not. Whether you care about whether there are policies to help you figure out how your transgender child can navigate school safely on the website, whether there's information about climate change on a website, or whether weather data is publicly available. Any one of those things is less important than the idea that we can decide through democratic processes the government does certain things. We can also decide through democratic processes the government doesn't do those things. But that suddenly now it's okay to have an elected leader who can just ignore or not validate, not
or
work
call it
from.
the deep state. Which is, in some ways.
That we got to do a whole nother episode on the deep state, frankly.
Yes,
until
we've run out
we
of time. Yeah.
Yes. So, but that I think that's the deeper problem with the state, if you will.
Yes. No. And that essentially what is it's simultaneously serving, because the Trump administration is clearly the executive branch, and yet they've also declared war on certain aspects of the permanent bureaucracy. And the result is, in a way that, previous Republican administrations have come in and been suspicious of bureaucrats, but not to the degree that, I was there during the Bush transition, and there were certainly culture clashes then, but there was also eventually a learning process that took place on both sides about what it was that the political appointees wanted, but also the political appointees learned the value of the permanent bureaucracy. And I think, in some ways, the crucial question for what the Trump administration looks like going forward is, does that mutual learning process take place or not?
Well, color me skeptical, but I will hope to be proven wrong, and then I will hope that sometime soon I will owe you a giant steak dinner. How about that?
There we go. I'm always happy to accept that.
All right. Till next time, blogging heads.
So long.